of the Ordinance Committee, Monday, November 17th. And Ms. Wall, would you call the roll, please? Oh, it's Tuesday, isn't it? No, this is
Tuesday, November 18th.
Tuesday, November 18th.
Councilmember Rouse.
Thank you, here.
Councilmember Murillo. Here. And Councilmember Hotchkiss. Here. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Is there any public comment on items that are not on the agenda? Okay. Do you have a speaker slip, Mr. Hanson? I need a speaker slip, though, please.
Oh,
Limited to 2 minutes.
can I give it to you afterwards?
Yes.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
We're starting a boycott Santa Barbara State Street. Stop the hate, fear, and propaganda towards all homeless people. There are some that need to be spanked. Be not afraid. A mayor, a governor, or a United States president can sign an executive action to have a national agenda to stop all the city's wars against their unhoused citizens. This is happening not just in Santa Barbara. This is happening all across the nation. Thousands of cities have issues with homeless. A mayor or governor or president could sign an executive action stating that we want to have homeless as a protected class. So we stop this hate mongering. So we're asking people, we're handing these out on State Street. We're asking people to boycott State Street. And it would just be a pin signing. The mayor could do it, and the governor or president, you just sign your executive action stating that you want something to happen instead of what's happening, spreading hate and fear. If this was to be happening to gays, blacks, women, it would be appalling. People would be outraged, but it's happening towards homeless. And the other day, Nancy and I were out on State Street, and everyone was kind of behaving themselves. There was no police officers. 8 o'clock on Saturday night. I invite you to go down and look and see what's happening on a Saturday or Friday night on State Street. We saw a police officer in a car up by McDonald's going through the parking lot. And it was like, why not on State Street? There was one person down by Joe's Cafe. He had been drinking, homeless person. He was kind of a quarter way in to the ramp that people use for wheelchairs. And that should have been said, hey, you can't do that. And there was other people that were sitting there with their belongings and stuff and trying to sell things. But anyway, we're at where we're at. We spread this hate and fear and propaganda, and I think we need to stop it. There's lots of help that we can do. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, unless there are other speakers for comments not on the agenda, we'll close public comment. And we are here to discuss some ordinance committee or some proposed amendments to the municipal code. And Mr. Colon, do you have a presentation?
I do, thank you. Well, let me begin with a little bit of background about why we're here. The Ordinance Committee and Council about 6 years ago in 2008 took up the question of whether to restrict parking of recreational vehicles on certain streets. And that ordinance provided that RV parking could be restricted when there was an excessive number of RVs parked near certain sensitive land uses, places like schools, child care centers, parks, community care facilities. What the ordinance did not do was define the term excessive. And so over the years, that ordinance has been implemented with the discretion of the Public Works Director in consultation with the police to apply sometimes to one RV, sometimes to two, sometimes to three or four. So the term excessive has not been defined. The second reason we're here today is that last June, the Ninth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals ruled in a case called Desert Rain versus City of Los Angeles that an ordinance forbidding sleeping in cars was unconstitutionally vague because it forbade using a car as living quarters. And the court decided that the term living quarters was so broad that an officer would have tremendous discretion whether or not to prosecute, and further found that the context of that ordinance and the enforcement of that ordinance grew out of an effort to eradicate homeless people from the Venice Beach area of Los Angeles. We have an ordinance that forbids parking of RVs, and that's clearly defined and clearly defensible under the Desert Rain case. However, we also have a definition of what we call temporary RVs. And temporary RVs under our code are any vehicle that's equipped for sleeping or human habitation or camping purposes. The example I used in the staff report is that that definition is so broad that it could apply to someone driving a sedan through town with a sleeping bag in it. And I believe that's exactly the kind of vagueness that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found repugnant in the Desert Rain case coming out of L.A. So the second part of the recommendation is to repeal the prohibition on temporary RV parking so that we would no longer attempt to regulate overnight accommodations in regular cars that might be equipped for sleeping in some manner. With respect to the excessive number of RVs in the first ordinance that we're talking about, I'm proposing that the committee consider 3 or more RVs to be excessive. There is no magic in that number. It might be a different number. All I can tell you is that I think excessive has to mean more than 1 RV. Now, also important to understanding this is that the staff came to the Ordinance Committee in November of 2008 with an ordinance that did not contain any restrictions on either the location where RVs would be prohibited. In other words, it didn't make any reference to sensitive land uses like schools or child care facilities. And also it didn't make any reference to the number of RVs that might be prohibited. It was a flat-out authorization to the Public Works Director in consultation with the police chief to post signs forbidding RVs from parking. The Ordinance Committee felt that that was too, that approach gave too much discretion to the Public Works Director, and so the Ordinance Committee between November and December of 2008 added the restriction that only an excessive number of RVs could be prohibited and that only RVs parked in certain locations could be prohibited. So there was a policy decision made in 2008 to limit the discretion of the relevant city officials in applying that ordinance. That's the gist of the report. Further background is worth getting into just a little bit. As I point out in the staff report, when the city originally attempted to deal with the problem of excessive RV parking, it passed an ordinance and posted only the 33 entrances to the city that were identified by the city attorney. The Court of Appeal recognized that the city had the authority to ban RVs in certain locations, but said that signposting had to happen on each block face, that just posting the entrances to town did not give sufficient notice to people who might park their RVs in a particular area. That case involved a group called Homes on Wheels, and at the mayor's urging, I began meeting with representatives of Homes on Wheels last spring. We met through the summer, and I represented to them that I would come to the Ordinance Committee with a definition of excessive because of their concern, and they had done a public records request showing that in many instances the excessive number of RVs had been only one RV. So I represented to them, and I followed through with this report, that I would propose a fixed number for the definition of excessive. The Homes on Wheels lawsuit was ultimately settled to allow the city to forbid RV parking with minimal signage in what I'd loosely term the waterfront areas, basically seaward of the freeway between the Bird Refuge and Castillo, I believe. One can argue that that settlement agreement implied that the city would not post other areas for no RV parking. The settlement agreement does not say that. In fact, it says that the city council is reserving its full authority to exercise its RV regulatory responsibilities however it wants. But I suspect you'll hear today that that settlement agreement is a limitation on the council's power to further regulate RVs. I point that out as background because we're dealing in kind of a gray area, and it may be an issue that the courts ultimately need to resolve again. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Colon, a couple of definitions for me. You mentioned area and you mentioned block face. Is a specific block face in this definition also an area? Or by area, do you mean an area like the waterfront or the mesa or something along those lines?
The ordinance calls for posting on streets or street block faces. So it's a street-by-street posting that has to happen.
So, in other words, if the council were to decide the ordinance precludes taking another full area like the waterfront we did as part of the settlement, but they could decide to do a block face by block or a specific block face if there was a finding made.
I think so.
Okay. My second question was you talked about the temporary RVs and you talked about RVs. So is a temporary RV is not an RV to start with? In other words, it's not a manufactured RV.
Right.
So the restrictions or the limitations on enforcement are different for those two categories?
Yes. The Los Angeles case didn't find any fault with parking restrictions on obvious RVs. It did find fault with parking restrictions on vehicles that happened to show evidence of human habitation.
Okay.
Like sleeping bags or bottles of urine that were in those cars.
And then just to further noodle that a little bit, the temporary RV for human habitation versus the overnight camping ordinance in public places. Now that sounds like it's going to be a pretty gray area, and I understand the Los Angeles decision. But I was thinking about, certainly in a coastal area and the surf is good and there's 50 cars all of a sudden they're camping overnight in a public street, which may or may not be in the public interest. So is there a definition between clearly we're talking about somebody who needs the car for shelter versus somebody who might opt to camp?
The proposal that I'm making would take away the city's ability to enforce an overnight camping rule against vehicles other than recreational vehicles as they're defined in the vehicle code.
All right, thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you. So just so I understand, if we went along with this recommendation and defined excessive, this would not have any effect on already posted areas such as the waterfront, Cabrillo, et cetera?
That's correct.
All right. And overnight camping would be still forbidden in any RV in the city? Not a temporary vehicle, but a temporary domicile.
The code currently forbids overnight parking of trailers, semi-trailers, buses, mobile homes, or any other vehicles, but does not forbid overnight parking of RVs.
It does not. So somebody could park overnight on the streets as long as it wasn't posted.
That's correct.
Captain Witham, we talked about overnight sleeping in non-RVs. Is that a problem now? You see much of that, I guess I want to say.
Councilmember Hotchkiss, are you referring to the temporary vehicles?
Yeah.
I did a check on that, and I didn't see that we've cited that in the past 5 years. So I don't see a lot of that. And just dealing specifically with, say, a car with somebody sleeping in it, I'm sure it happens, but it hasn't been as problematic as the RVs.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. At least we got a benchmark. If it increases when we change this, then we'll know we opened the door. Secondly, do we have many RVs that are on the streets overnight now?
Well, they're dotted throughout the city, yes.
What's that?
They're dotted throughout the city. If you just take a drive in the early morning hours, and there are RVs in locations that aren't posted.
And do we have any idea what that number is?
I don't know.
Would you guess 20, 30, 10?
Anecdotally, 20 to 30.
20, 30, okay, thank you.
Okay, very good.
No, thank you.
So with that, I think we'll go to public comment, and it'll be 2 minutes per speaker, and please on the subject of the RV ordinance. So we'll start with Diane Bergman Duncan.
Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak today. As Randy said, my name's Diane Barrickman Duncan. I've been a practicing physical therapist in Santa Barbara for 28 years. My husband and I have lived on Cliff Drive for 24 years. We own 3 properties on Cliff Drive. The RV problem on Cliff Drive is getting worse. Since January 2014, there has literally been an invasion of RVs parked in front of our 3 properties. These RVs pose a serious safety threat to being able to see oncoming traffic when pulling onto Cliff Drive. They jeopardize our safety in our homes, as often there are several individuals living in the RVs, not uncommonly drinking alcohol, doing drugs, not uncommonly arguing, disturbing the peace, leaving their trash, broken beer bottles, plastic bottles filled with urine on or in front of our properties. There's also a fire hazard, as we have seen these individuals pour gasoline into their RVs and spill it onto the ground, and we do have photos. I have many, many photos. Homeless and what to do with these individuals who reside in Santa Barbara is an ongoing debate. Another factor is what to do with the many RVs, campers, and conversion vans used by the homeless in our city. Many of these large RVs or even conversion vans are used only as a base, with many smaller second vehicles being used to take these individuals to their jobs or other areas in the community. The RVs are left vacant during the day, only to then be used as sleeping quarters at night when they are dropped back off at the RV.
You'll need to wrap up, please.
And Seymour Duncan is going to secede his
Mr. Duncan,
ability to speak to me.
you have 2 more minutes.
My husband and I personally witnessed 4 men who were parked in an RV in front of our home being picked up by a smaller vehicle only to return when the sun goes down. We literally have seen very large campers parked in front of our property for as long as 10 days consecutively. The owners of these vehicles are very familiar with the regulations. They push the limits of the city ordinances. They are very aware of the 72-hour rule, and the only thing they need to do is literally move a couple inches, and they can stay another 72 hours. Both my husband and I have spoken with dispatchers who have often sent officers to our home on numerous occasions. But due to the size of the vehicles and the unknown number of individuals in these vehicles, oftentimes multiple cars need to be dispatched, taking away services from the rest of the city. Another concern is Cliff Drive is a designated safe route to Washington School and Santa Barbara City College. Children and young college students' safety is jeopardized when individuals are living on the street in RVs. I have a videotape of one of the men living in a conversion van going into and out of the bushes across from our property. These RVs and the people living in them jeopardize my safety, my husband's safety, and my neighbor's safety. And I urge your action to resolve this problem. Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss has a question for you, Ms.
Duncan,
Bergman.
please. How many, you got 3 properties, are they contiguous?
They're close.
So how many RVs are you talking about?
On any given day, there can be as many as 6.
Okay.
And I would love to hear you say more than 1 RV is excessive, because these are big. These aren't little mini campers. They're large. And when you've got 2 of them parked in front of your property with people living in them, it's a safety threat.
I'm assuming you're on a sort of level part of Cliff Drive, is that correct?
We were actually on a curve.
Yeah, but level? RVs usually want to park on a level area.
They don't mind parking on a curve.
Okay.
Sure.
Ms. Murillo has a question
What
for you.
is the cross street generally of where you're talking about Cliff and?
San Rafael would be one cross street, and then La Marina. So it's in between San Rafael and La Marina, and the road does bend there. And when the RVs are parked along the street on either side, it's very difficult to pull out and see oncoming traffic. I have numerous pictures as well for anybody who would like them.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker will be Peter Marin, followed by Bob Hanson.
I'm going to need more than 2 minutes, but Nancy McCready has given me.
Very good. You have 4 minutes.
Okay. Anyway,
I'm sorry, Mr. Hanson, are you going to give your minutes as well? Yeah. Then you have then
yeah.
6 minutes, Mr.
I
Mayor.
appreciate that because we were involved with the original suit, and we are now planning a follow-up suit pertaining to this ordinance, so I'd like to give you a little of that history. It goes back to the point at which the city decided to try to ban all RVs from the city, and it became clear, we were in state court at that point, it became clear that the court was very sympathetic to our position. Indeed, at the time, in one of their opinions, they compared the city's RV laws to the Okie laws of the 1930s, and it became pretty clear that they were going to favor us with a decision at some point. So we did settle with the city. I don't want to discuss the terms exactly because they're supposedly confidential, though they're pretty clear. We did get some money for our attorneys because, in essence, we won that particular case. And then, a few years later, the present ordinance was adopted of an excessive number of RVs in relation to basically public buildings. I've talked to Grant House, who was on that ordinance committee, and he has told me, and I'm sure he would be glad to tell you if you talk to him, that this was never intended to be used the way it has been used now. It was meant to prevent, quite honestly, the accumulation of RVs that we've just heard described here. What happened over time was that the police began to interpret this in a more and more liberal fashion, if I can use that word. And at some point, we now have a list of 8 single-spaced pages. That's 8 single-spaced pages of streets wherein RVs are forbidden to park, right? And this includes sites which are not just a hospital, a church, but it includes a dance studio, an acupuncture clinic. They've gone out of their way to interpret this in any way possible to prevent RVs from parking. I've been through the documents. The police sometimes claimed that they had to do this because they were obstructing traffic or creating a danger, but there was only one case like that. The signing of streets was almost automatic. They found one RV. They didn't ask anybody to leave. They just said, well, there's an RV. Let's see if there's a park or a church or a school or anything eligible close by. And at that point, they would sign up to 500 feet, which is actually 9 to 12 blocks in every conceivable direction. So that one RV would precipitate the signing of up to 12 streets, because they would take 2 streets, which was within 500 feet, and then part of the third and include that. So you sort of got 3 streets in every direction. Now, when they passed that ordinance, I specifically went to talk to Das Williams, who had been on that ordinance committee, Grant House, and Helene Schneider. All of them assured me at the time that this was only an ordinance to be used in emergency situations, and therefore we did not make an issue of it because it seemed to us a reasonable kind of ordinance to use, because you don't want too many RVs near a school or a church or this or that. However, of course, one of our problems was the extent to which the phrase excessive number was being defined by the police as one or more. And it's pretty clear to any rational person that if the ordinance had meant to say one or more, it would have said one or more. Instead, it said excessive number, which was vague, but too vague, I think, to pass constitutional examination. So that was one of our issues. There are, however, 2 other issues which are paramount to us in the suit we are actually going to bring, and it's in the process of being brought now. We have Joe Allen as our lawyer and a woman named Allison Adams who's from Los Angeles. It's a suit to be brought in federal court. And here are the 2 other issues besides the phrase excessive number. One is the fact that disabled people and disability stickers are not exempt from this ordinance. So what you get is the prevention of someone with a disabled sticker being unable to park near a church or a school or a park or a hospital, which are exactly the sites which ADA regulations are meant to guarantee them access to. So what you get here is not a parking problem, but it's a question of whether or not this violates ADA laws. Now, there is a section of the ADA federal law in which it says that cities and counties must, the word is must, adjust their procedures and policies to make sites available to the disabled. So why this was never done with this ordinance, I don't understand. Because this ordinance even includes the blue spaces within these forbidden areas. So if there's a blue space within a block of a hospital, an RV with a disability sticker cannot park there even now. And it would have been the easiest thing in the world to exempt one RV from not being able to park in one space. That doesn't seem to create any kind of danger, doesn't seem to create any kind of excess, and it would seem to me that you guys would be reasonable in thinking over the relation of this ordinance to the disabled. Because it doesn't seem to me that granting people access to these places with disability stickers is going to create a big problem. I don't see it. There's a place down on the east side, 2 spots, where on the same post there's be a blue area, and on that post it says disabled parking, and right above it it says no RV parking. Now, we've never even tested that, though I do know that Denise de Belfoy, the judge, threw out a case where an RV was parked near the hospital and got a ticket, and it had a disability sticker, and she just threw the case out of court. I don't think this will stand up, but that's a relatively minor issue. The other issue is the fact that we would like to see rolled back those streets which have signs which were put up for one vehicle. Because it would seem to me that if someone parked in that area and got a ticket, given the vagueness of the old ordinance, that the ticket would never stand up in court if pursued.
You'll need to wrap up, please.
Okay, so we were going to federal court basically about these 2 issues, presuming that the excessive number is resolved in some reasonable fashion, and we would like to stay out of court. That's why we went and talked to the city attorney, and I'm hoping that you or the council will sit down and talk with us about a way to resolve these matters before we end up in court.
Thank you.
May I ask a question,
Ms. Murillo.
Mr. Marin? So how would we know if a posting was done just because of one RV? Or maybe that's a question for staff.
We did a document search from the police, and it's quite clear in the documents. There's a sort of verbal history of someone calling in and saying there's a vehicle. Then someone goes out to see if there's a vehicle. Then they check to see if there's a church or a school or anything near it. And then the sign goes up. So it's very clear from reading the documents the number of RVs that are involved. And I've been through those documents, and I can pick out 10 or 12 cases in which there was one RV clearly involved and no more.
So you're asking that be repealed, or you're going to go to court? Or?
Well, yes, I don't think those would stand up in court, and we could easily park an RV in one of those areas, get a ticket, and then appeal the ticket all the way up to the higher court. Or we could just go to federal court and say if someone got a ticket in these areas, it wouldn't stand up. Can you make a ruling?
Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thanks for your presentation. One of the things that I'm trying to resolve is that, unfortunately, for the large RV populace, there are there's a criminal minority, if I can put it that way, that have used RVs or a single RV for nefarious purposes, whether it's drug dealing or prostitution or tobacco, whatever. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
So in a sense, they've sort of poisoned the well for other people. It's not fair, but that's the case. And an RV in and of itself presents a closed locus that unfortunately allows somebody to virtually move their apartment to an area where there might be vulnerabilities. For instance, near a school, where the last thing you want is kids exposed to this kind of stuff, and parks perhaps also. How would you deal with that problem without excluding all RVs there? Unfairly so, I agree, but still I'm talking about protecting kids.
Well, I think there's flexibility here. For instance, I have no problem with a law that would say, no, you can't put any RV within 2.5 blocks of a school. I don't have a problem with that. A hospital is a different matter. A park is a slightly different matter. A church is a different matter. This lumps a whole lot of things together, right, where we would all agree it would be a problem. I would not, if my kid was going to a school, want to see an anonymous RV parked there sort of for days or weeks on end. We agree about that. But what I think happened was because when this was originally adopted, it was meant to be an emergency measure. Nobody fine-tuned it, right? Nobody looked at it closely. Nobody thought about disabled people. It was just a sort of rushed catch-all thing which seemed to make sense at the time, but was not examined carefully, right? So I would distinguish between a school and an acupuncture clinic, for instance. I don't think the same ordinance applies to them both equally sensibly. So I'm in sympathy with this position. I'm also in sympathy with this position. I would not want to be on a street with 6 RVs parked outside. But I want to say 2 things. The more streets you sign, the more RV people are forced into smaller and smaller areas. So they tend more to collect together than they used to. And the second thing is we do have an RV parking program which provides up to 30 spaces. The curious thing about that program is that 2/3 of the spaces were taken up by people sleeping in their cars and not by RVs. And if the sleeping in your car rule changed, maybe more of those people would be on the street. But I would think that to go along with any kind of ordinance, there would be a concerted attempt to increase the number of city and county spaces made available to the homeless for overnight parking. We once had a task force put together, I believe, by the county, though it might have been the city. And the one thing that task force unanimously decided was that where there were to be no more RV ordinances, not that it was binding on anyone, but there would be no more RV ordinances until there were sufficient spaces for people to park. Most of the people in RVs, because I know them from the RV parking program, are decent people struggling to get by. They're living on pensions. Many of them are vets, right? And I would say finally that, yes, there are a few people in RV that make a problem, but there's a few people in houses that make a problem, and we don't take everybody's house away just because of that. There are laws against prostitution. There are laws against drug dealing. And I'm not quite clear why the police can't enforce those laws if those things are going on.
Well, those are reactions, at least if I may respond. Those are reactions to things that should never have happened in the first place, particularly around schools with kids, et cetera. So that's a very special circumstance. The other thing that bothers me or makes me wonder is people spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or more to buy a wonderful home in Santa Barbara with a view, et cetera. And if somebody comes and parks a boat in front of their house or an RV or whatever, we ought to try not to have that happen because it essentially removes of some value, at least to them, of their property. Are you in accord with that?
I don't disagree about this. I think there's many possible remedies. I mean, I have always thought, the parking program has a sort of sticker system where you get a sticker if you're in the parking program. I would think it possible for the city to give people stickers, right, depending on their good behavior, to park in a certain area of the city and distribute RVs over the city so they didn't collect. There was one person, 3 parked down on the east side, 3 parked on the west side. Many solutions are possible, but no one has sat down and tried to figure out what to do.
Well, if I could just comment briefly on that and then we can move on. But I think you would agree that we don't want to open Santa Barbara and its streets to anybody that would like to camp here, because those in need are going to be different than those who recreate. So, you agree?
Yes,
okay.
I agree. However, we're a tourist town, we're a pretty town, and we're a rich town. But we're a pretty town, a tourist town, and a rich town that has a lot of poor people. And we don't know how to accommodate those poor people. We know the waiting list for housing is 3 to 5 years.
Right, but I just don't want to invite more people here because in a situation that's already difficult.
I get that. If you had a permit process, you could decide who deserved a permit and who didn't.
On the RV program, as I remember when I first saw it, it was an attempt to help people get back on their feet. And I'm not sure it's been successful, but we can discuss that at another point.
I would just say this. Some people get back on their feet. I know because we make loans to those people. But what we have now are disabled people who get $800 to $900 a month, which is not sufficient for living inside in Santa Barbara. We have retired people. We now have retired seniors living at the rescue mission because they can't afford to live here anymore. There's a real problem here having to do with poverty, and the RVs are only one part of it, and someone has to confront it sometime because we don't have a right to drive these people out of town.
Okay, in closing the comments, thank you for being respectful not only of your clients, if I could put it that way, but the other people who they affect. I think that's
it's a real problem
important
for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go to the actual action items that have been listed here, and which would be, number 1, to define the excessive term of RV parking, as well as the part of the temporary recreational vehicles, the prohibition about camping. So we have 2 issues, am I correct, Mr. Colon, to deal with on this one? And so I'll entertain comments or questions from the committee. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Mr. Colon, I understand the temporary vehicle thing. That makes sense. And the excessive seems to make sense also. I was at the post office this morning over in Milpas, that area, and there were 4 RVs camped out there. Camped, I say, because all the shades were pulled and all that. And this was 9:30, so that would affect that particular situation. But I think he brings up a good point and acknowledges we have a significant problem, or that we should work to prevent, which is around schools. He said 2.5 blocks. I don't, that's fine, whatever the number is. But is it possible to include in this a prohibition of RV parking within an X amount of distance from a school?
Councilmember Hotchkiss, the existing ordinance says that you can post when an excessive number of RVs are parked within 500 feet of any school or educational institution. So it's already covered.
Well, yes and no, because I'm saying that one RV could be a problem if it's the wrong person in there, as he acknowledged. So to protect children, how would we do that so that they could not park RVs there? Could we post us at no parking around schools?
Yeah, and this is, let me digress for a second. Mr. Marin alluded to the Americans with Disabilities Act and what it may or may not require. We know now, because of a case this summer called Fortune versus City of Lomita, that the ADA requires cities to provide on-street parking for the disabled. That the ADA had never been interpreted that way, and nor are there any guidelines telling you what kind of parking you have to have for the disabled. So it is unclear right now whether we must, for example, have RV parking near hospitals, near churches, near schools. Our argument, should we be faced with that kind of litigation, would be that there are ample areas that are posted for 75-minute or 90-minute parking where RVs with disabled placards can park as long as they wish, and that 500 feet is not an impenetrable or an insurmountable barrier for people to travel. So I think that it is probably dangerous to forbid any RV parking near a school. I think the existing regulation is probably the most defensible approach to take, and that limits an excessive number within 500 feet.
Dangerous in what way? Could it be challenged in court?
Yes, I'm worried about this, again, this Fortune versus Lomita case that also came out after Desert Rain. And that it was a difficult case for the court because the city of Lomita had no place in the entire city where a disabled placard vehicle could park. We certainly have ample areas.
No, we don't have that problem.
And the question is, how far will that case be extended by the federal courts? And so I just can't make a prediction. I do get concerned about no parking areas around hospitals, schools, places of basic necessity for people with RVs. And as I say, our current rules allow RVs to park within 500 feet of those locations, and that shouldn't be an insurmountable barrier. But if you forbade any parking near a school or near a church or near a hospital, I think you might be crossing the line.
Well, I'll go back to what Mr. Marin said. He himself would be uncomfortable if there was an anonymous RV parked near school or his kids were walking to school. So, in a sense, we have both sides in agreement here. I don't see any disagreement in the audience, although this is a small audience. But I'd appreciate to hear what Ms. Murillo has to say. But it seems to me this is a reasonable and thoughtful and carefully thought-out modification of our ordinance to prevent and protect children and parents who are trying to encourage their kids to go by either bike or foot to school, and we're not allowing them this extra element of safety. I'd like to hear what my other, as well as you, I've already heard that you don't think it's a good idea, but my other colleagues on the committee here.
Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would like to address the Duncan's issues first, and Captain Whittam, to ask you if you could give us a snapshot of issues related to Cliff Drive. I know our officers, you know our city very well, and patterns and people's behavior. What kind of advice can you give them about, obviously, if there's criminal behavior, the police department would respond?
Councilmember Murillo, yes. I think they said it very well, what the problems are. You have 6 RVs in the area. They cause issues with health and safety problems. You know, you have bottles of urine. We've seen that before. You've had all these health and safety. And, you know, we're fortunate to have our Beat Coordinator program, which we talk about posting the RV signs, it's typically our beat coordinators that work with Public Works to get that done. And it's also usually generated from a complaint from those in the area. So my suggestion is areas like that, and I'm not quite sure about Cliff Drive and the posting on Cliff Drive is it's a main artery, but we definitely would work with them in the posting once we clear up the ordinance issues.
Okay. And you do consider visibility and line of sight when traffic safety, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, especially if you're on a curve like the Duncans had outlined, that does create a traffic hazard in terms of trying to pull out in different areas. There's a blind spot that occurs. I'm not quite sure if that in and of itself is a reason to post for RVs, but we can certainly work with our beat coordinators and attempt to find those traffic related as well as the health and safety issues to post RV prohibitions.
Thank you. So the two items that are before us are defining excessive, and I would support staff recommendation is 3 or more on a street or street block face. So that seems like it needs to be defined a little more tightly if we're trying to be very careful with our definitions. So a street, my street is West Valerio, and that's kind of a long street. So do we mean street or do we mean street block face, Mr. Kalan? I'm looking at the first page of the council agenda report.
Yeah, the ordinance refers to street, portion of the street, or block face.
Okay. Okay.
I would read it practically speaking to mean within no further than 500 feet apart on a street.
Okay, so but we should be really clear about that, right? If there's one RV in the 800 block of West Valerio and then there's one in the 900 block, does that create a mass of concern?
I notice that Mr. Allen is here. He might be able to address that.
Well, I think it's a legal question, isn't it?
Well, he can address what we've been actually doing.
I'm happy to hear Mr. Allen. Thank you.
Having been here when the ordinance was adopted, so I have a little bit of history with the ordinance, but basically what we have experienced is a lot of the uses that have been identified in the ordinance typically are in the middle of a block. So you look at 500 feet from the property line, it could go into the next block. So, and especially if it's a school, or a designated safe route to school, we want to go with the 500 feet. So it might be a block and a half away from the actual location of the facility. So when we say a street, it's 500 feet from that location. So it might necessarily be in that block face. There might be one in the block, and maybe another one within 500 feet in the next block, but it's still within the 500 feet. So the way the ordinance is written has been used. It has not been confusing for my staff when they have to go out and post the signs, and they do work closely with the beat coordinators before we actually go out there and put the signs up.
Okay. Well, if you're saying it's clear enough to you, but I'm going to do more research before the city council takes this up. I mean, I'm really concerned about the disability issue, among other things here. And then for the second issue that's on for our review is repealing what I think is an incredibly confusing expression, temporary recreational vehicles. So I'm glad that you are proposing to strike that out of the ordinance language. I have other comments, and Mr. Marin left the room. I wanted to let him know that I would be interested in restarting that task force. I think there's a lot of different issues to look at. Certainly, one RV causing trouble, making noise, spilling gas is unacceptable. I like the idea of expanding the New Beginnings program and finding more parking spaces if that's what's needed. Perhaps New Beginnings needs funding for general outreach. And the other thought I had was, which I've had for a long time in thinking about RVs, is back when the zoo was, Nancy, did they call it hobo jungle? Or that there was actually sort of this self-governance there. And there was someone who was recognized as a mayor. And if someone got out of line and caused trouble, people said, this is our community. We all need to act right. And that perhaps there can be a leadership council of RV dwellers who will watch the bad apples, as you're saying, Mr. Hotchkiss, because I have had friends, my own personal friends, who have lived in cars. And a woman who had 2 dogs, and she was just trying to find a place to live. Santa Barbara's a hard place to find a rental if you have pets. So she was living in a van, nice lady. I think another guy I knew who lived in his car, they take showers at the gym, and they don't do with this is a different kind of population of people who live in their car, and they're not drug addicts. They're just people who are down on their luck. And they would never park near a school and bother children who were going by, or a child care facility. So I just wanted to say we just need to be aware that we're talking about different kinds of characters, and I'm glad that you pointed that out yourself, Mr. Hotchkiss. So self-governance. When one of the RV dwellers that I had contact with, I will sometimes patrol with the Casa Esperanza homeless shelter volunteers, and we met a woman who was doing prostitution and drug dealing out of her RV, and she was sassing me and sticking up for herself, and she wasn't doing anything wrong. And then when I went to go, find out further, she was doing these criminal behaviors. And so you're right that the bad apples make it difficult for the people who are struggling in this town. So maybe the community, there can be a different kind of response from the community or from New Beginnings, and they do a good job. I understand they do house people. Remember one year we had a report from them, and in the past year they had housed 57 people. They had helped 57 people go from living in their car to housing of some kind.
Ms. Marie, I'm going to ask you to
I'm making my deliberations.
But if we can get down to what we're here to, which is the 2 points in the ordinance request, because we're getting into different areas there, if you don't mind. We're talking about the excessive RV definition, as well as the repeal of the temporary recreational vehicle request by council.
Thank you for allowing me to look through my notes. I believe as an elected official, I get to talk about the issues that are brought before here and not talk too much, Mr. Rouse. Again, I'm concerned about the disabled issue. I am personally going to go out there and do some research about, I think a disabled person living in an RV should be able to park closer than 500 feet to a hospital door. And I'm going to find out about how this affects those people. Traffic obstruction, okay. That's it. Thank you for Thank you for letting me speak.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, so to the 2 issues, which one is, I think I would like to take the one first about the temporary recreational vehicle, because Mr. Klon, basically what your point is that as we have it currently listed, it's not defensible, so we need to strike that from the ordinance. Is that your recommendation?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and I would propose, if it's with the committee's approval, to take this in 2 motions, if we could. Sure. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Yeah, that's fine, and I'll make a motion to pass the first.
So that's the one about the striking the temporary recreational vehicles. Does that have a second?
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, that passes. The second one will be defining the recreational vehicle. And I have a question, the excessive recreational vehicles. Mr. Colon, could that be read as 2 or more as opposed to 3 or more?
Yes.
I'm just thinking about the situation why we would want to allow a gathering of these, and thinking about the quiet enjoyment of property owners that may have either views or aesthetics interrupted by gatherings of vehicles. So I would put forth to the committee that maybe we might want to define this as 2 or more. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Mr. Cullen, is there a legal problem with that change?
I don't believe so.
All right, thank you. I'd support that.
Ms. Murillo?
Well, I don't, and I said in my deliberations, if you were listening, that I wanted 3 or more, so I'll be voting no on that.
Okay.
And I think we need to do a little more research about a street face, a block face, and the definition of that. I respect you, Mr. Allen. I'm just not entirely assured by what you're saying, so I'm just going to take a little more time on that.
How about I just get together with you and we can discuss it. Maybe we can go out and take a look at an example of how we imply it.
I would love that. Thank you so much. But I'll be voting no.
Okay. Mr. Hotchkiss.
If we made a motion and I voted to agree with this, how would I also at some point get the council to consider my comments about a single RV around a school? That's not on the agenda right now, I guess, so we can't talk about that. But
No, I think it's within the scope of what the committee has in front of it. I think you could make a third motion to recommend the council consider eliminating any RV parking near schools.
all right, so let's again take that one at a time.
Okay, so I'm
Can
sorry.
I make a comment on that? So,
Yes.
so what if there's an RV dweller that has kids and the kids go to the school and they're parked near the school?
They drop them off at school just like anybody else.
For me, I need a little more time to think about this. These are people's lives we're talking about. So if you made that motion and Mr. Rouse
I'm not
seconded
sure
it, I would vote no.
I'm sure I don't know what the motion is yet, though. Do you have the motion, Mr. Hotchkiss?
Well, let's take this one at a time. The first is to define excessive as 2 or more.
Okay.
2 or more.
Is that a motion?
It is.
Okay, and I'll second that. Ms. Murillo, comments?
I'm voting no. Thank
Okay.
you.
So in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Okay, thank you. So it passes 2-3. And then, Mr. Hotchkiss, you have a further motion.
I do, that we restrict all RV parking within a defined distance of schools in order to protect children. And the definition of what that distance should be, we would have to get down in the weeds about.
If I can ask a question, I think, Mr. Allen, because I was around during that, not in office, but I remember the discussion regarding that. And I do remember school administrators and principals and whatnot, because of the gatherings of, it was actually pretty large numbers of RVs over by Santa Barbara High and Junior High. And that there was also in that nearby industrial area. So there were a number of complaints about the gathering of RVs, and of course there were activities which, were going on as well, which were illegal activities. But at that time, and I don't recall this nuance of the 1 or more or excessive number parked around the schools. So is that, because at one time, weren't they posted as strictly no RV parking, or am I not remembering that right?
Well, when we came back to the ordinance committee after we had brought the first version of it, we had suggested no RV parking within 500 feet of schools, or no RV parking around schools. And then the council, the ordinance committee at the time said within 500 feet, excessive RV parking. So we had initially had a blanket no RV parking around any school, and then the ordinance, which recommended by the ordinance committee, to within 500 feet if there's basically a problem based on the recommendation from the police department. So we had to explore that back in 2008 when we did the first the amendment we're talking about.
So, Mr. Colon, is that definition of 500 feet around a school defensible? In terms of if there was a restriction on RV parking, it would be around, like, for example, Santa Barbara High campus is a big campus. So how do you measure, is it from any border of the school, or is it from the center of the school and block face? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of definitions there.
Well, yes, it is defensible. As Mr. Allen said, what happened was that the staff came to the ordinance committee in November of 2008 without any restrictions whatsoever regarding distance or excessive. and the ordinance committee added those restrictions in. So it's my belief that state law would allow you to post any area for no RV parking, so long as you posted each block face.
Because as I recall as well, the settlement when Judge DeBuffy handed down her decree about having to post every block face as opposed to just marking the city entrances, which is a practice that's actually done in other parts of the state. That our settlement agreement, Mr. Allen, you may remember this, was that if we were going to restrict it, we would just post each block face that needed to be restricted.
Well,
and out of that came the New Beginnings program. And
several things came out of it. One, we have the settlement agreement where we have the no RV overnight between midnight and 6 a.m., basically in the waterfront area, and that's been posted. What the judge said in one of the hearings was, I don't have a problem with you guys restricting RVs, but you just can't post the entrance to the city. So if you want to restrict them, you have to sign the individual blocks. And she basically knew that that's kind of onerous, and it's a maintenance issue for us to sign every single street. That's why we came back with the ordinance allowing us to park certain streets if there was an issue, and then now we have the ordinance that we currently have. You know, in terms of disabled parking, we talked about that before the ordinance was adopted. I know the Arts and Crafts Show had an issue with that. They felt they should be exempt to be able to park all day long. The problem we have, if you have a handicap placard, you can park all day long. And that was an issue for other people not being able to get into their parks. That's one of the issues that we were experiencing prior to, and we've addressed with the ordinance.
okay. Well, you also have questions or comments?
No, we got a motion.
Are
We
you
got
going
a
to vote on
second.
that?
Yeah, so would you repeat the motion, please, Mr. Hotchkiss?
Right, that we restrict RV parking to none around schools within, you think, 500 feet.
Okay, so I'll second that. And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye?
Opposed.
Okay, so that's 2-3 as well. You have that, Ms. One? Okay. Okay, and I believe we've covered that. Clearly, there's going to be a pretty lively discussion, I think, in full council, if I read Mrs. Murillo correctly. And this meeting stands adjourned. Thank you.